it's a great time. Tonight's speaker is Rob Mazza, and Rob and I have known each other for well over a decade, many decades. We grew up together on Toronto Island in the 50s, and Rob's twin brother, Ron, and he were my younger brother's best friends. So this is a kind of a reunion. Rob and I worked together on a few things. Ron, of course, is, and I've just found out, is currently the Commodore of the Queen City Yacht Club in Toronto. So their involvement in the sailing sport is deep. I raced against Red Jacket a long time ago, and she was evil. Now, Rob will tell us that she wasn't. She was, because she was so fast and so well sailed. So I'm really, really looking forward to tonight's event. And I'd like to thank Rob as well for his contribution to the Canadian marine industry, which has been incredibly significant. It wouldn't be what it is without him and a couple of others. So I'm looking forward to tonight's presentation, and it's great to see you again, Rob. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ross, for the introduction to the series and to the speaker this evening. Again, so for those of you who first time joining us this evening, I welcome you to our Nautical Nights Winter Speaker Series. It's now spring, but it's nevertheless the tail end of our Winter Speaker Series, now in its 4th year. And what a series it has been this year. Have covered a number of different topics from, well, this evening, sailing to early French Indigenous relations, historical ballads. What was the first one? Shipwrecks, and of course, the Franklin expedition early on. So there's been a number of topics covered this season, and all by wonderful, wonderful speakers, and I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. For those of you who have not joined a Marine Museum program before, thank you again so much for joining us. The Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston is very much dedicated to connecting individuals like you with the maritime heritage of Kingston and the Great Lakes. And we do that on a number of different ways, including this Nautical Nights speaker series. The museum, I'm sure most of you are aware, has a very large collection, including maritime heritage items like artifacts from the shipbuilding industry, covering paintings from Peter Rundesbacher, for instance, and Nicholas Henderson. But we also have a very large CNC collection. And I'm very excited this evening to be able to share with you the fact that we are working on a research portal that will connect people with the collection, so making the collection a lot more accessible to the public. At the moment, we have an online database you can search, but quite often you're not able to see the items that we're talking about in the collection. And so the research portal we're developing will actually provide a digital component. So having thumbnails of the photographs of the ship plans and making it a lot more accessible to you so you can understand what you're looking at. And if you're interested in ordering anything, it will enable you to do that a lot more easily. So one of our first priorities is actually digitizing the CNC collection. We recently acquired some funding to start the digitizing process of that collection. And we'll be, in the next couple of weeks, actually scanning about 500 boat plans from the CNC collection. The museum actually houses over 4,000 ship plans from the CNC collection, as I'm told. And so we'll be working slowly to digitize that process. It's going to require a little bit more funding for it. So if you're able, we very much ask that you consider contributing to this project to help us digitize the remaining 3,500 ship plans. And to do that, there is a link in the YouTube chat, but you're also welcome to visit our website and just go to the donation form. And there's a drop-down menu that asks you to select the Digital Collections CNC Plans fund and help us achieve that goal. Great project to be a part of, and again, helping us make the collections a lot more accessible to you, the public. So as you know, Red Jacket will soon be joining the Marine Museum this summer, is my understanding. And Rob Mazza has graciously joined us this evening to tell the story of Red Jacket and a little bit more of the context behind the museum's acquisition of this beautiful vessel. I have not yet to see her, but I'm very excited about welcoming her to the Marine Museum at her historic location at 55 Ontario Street in Kingston, Ontario. As many of you know, Rob has a very long history in sailing and the sailing community. He's, for over 40 years, worked in the marine industry, designing for CNC Yachts, Mark Ellis Design, and Hunter Marine, before transitioning to sales and marketing with ATC Chemicals in Ontario and Baltec Inc. in New Jersey. Returning to Canada in 2011, Rob is currently semi-retired, if you call that Rob semi-retired, and acting as a contributing editor to the Good Old Boat magazine and chair of the Royal Hamilton Yacht Club Heritage Committee. He continues to follow his interest in the history of yachting while racing and cruising with his CNC Corvette Trillium 4 and with his wife Za at the helm. Rob has a Bachelor of Science honors in mechanical engineering from Queen's University and has a Master of Science in naval architecture and marine engineering from the University of Michigan. And we are very, very grateful to have Rob on our board of directors. He has curated, apologies, tongue-tied this evening, co-curated our New Age of Sail exhibit in 2014 and is the chair of the Canadian Sailing Hall of Fame Management Committee. So I'd ask you all to join me virtually in welcoming Rob to the screen. I'll ask you to unmute yourself, Rob.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Do I start the share screen now?
When you're ready, Rob, we're all ears.
Let's go.
And eyes.
All right, this is a strange experience talking to so many people. I gather, Michelle, that we have close to 200 people joining in tonight. And I had a quick look at the registration list, and there's a lot of people I know, a lot of old friends, a lot of people I'd like to be talking to right now rather than talking at. But that's the way the COVID restrictions have evolved, that there's only this one-way communication right now. But what I want to talk about is Red Jacket and her significance to the sailing industry, and the fact that she is coming to the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes this coming summer. And as Michelle said, that's very appropriate because the Marine Museum does hold the entire Cuthbertson and CNC Yachts collections and the Hinterholder collections of drawings. The Marine Museum did host the New Age of Sail exhibit, of which Red Jacket was very much a part, as was her owner, Peter Milligan. And we also host the Canadian Sailing Hall of Fame. And because of the arrival of Red Jacket, we're also going to be initiating, as Michelle alluded to, a web-based register of historic Canadian sailing craft. And that's going to record all the sailing craft in Canada that are over 50 years old and are Canadian built and or Canadian manufactured. And that's going to be a long list, as I say, starting with Red Jacket. But before we talk about Red Jacket specifically, I want to acknowledge her late owner, Peter Milligan. Peter Milligan was a friend of the museum, a very much supporter of all our efforts, including the New Age of Sail. As I mentioned, he brought Red Jacket to Kingston for that exhibit. He had told us previously that Red Jacket was going to come to the Marine Museum upon his death. He had bequeathed Red Jacket to the museum in his will, and nobody thought that was going to happen for another 10 to 20 years. But unfortunately, Peter suddenly passed away in 2018, and Red Jacket then became, through the estate, the property of the Marine Museum. We were supposed to get it last year, but of course with COVID, we put that off for a year, and now she's in Bristol Marine being prepared for delivery. And we're flattered and honored that Peter felt that the Marine Museum was the best place for Red Jacket to live out the rest of her life, basically. And we certainly are grateful to his wife, Doreen, and son, Jeremy, for being part of this whole program. And we hope they continue to be involved with Red Jacket as she's when she's at the museum. So what I'm going to talk about is the whole Red Jacket story. The people who created her, the design innovations that she incorporated, the unique composite construction method that led the way actually into all modern composites. that exists today. I'm talking about her race wins at the 67 and 68 SORC, the way she made her mark, and her significance to Canadian sailing specifically. It's unfortunate, but it's a consequence of her age, that almost everyone involved in Red Jacket are no longer with us today. But fortunately, I had the privilege and benefit to interview George Cuthbertson, Eric Bruckman, Perry Connolly, and John Byrne in some length. And they were exceptionally free in telling me all their background with Red Jacket. In the case of George, he was very free with his whole collection of photographs. And a lot of the photographs we're going to see today are from George's collections. And I need to acknowledge the help of Beverly Darville from the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. She's the archivist there, and she has been very helpful in providing information as well. I had a quick look at the people who registered for this event, and I was pleased to see Mike Dale has signed up. Mike Dale was involved in the Cuthbertson and Cassian design office when Red Jacket was being designed. And I was also pleased to see Laura Cassian, John Kelly Cuthbertson, and Richard Hinnerholer, children of the original founders of CNC Yachts, and very much part of the whole Red Jacket story. I'm going to start this presentation with this famous photograph from 1973 of the CNC design office. This is 5 years after Red Jacket. But the point I wanted to make with this photograph is that everyone standing in that photograph, with the exception of George Cassian here, is standing there because of Red Jacket. In my own case, I mean, I remember quite distinctly being in my second year at Queen's, studying engineering, when I read in the Globe and Mail that Red Jacket had won the 1968 Southern Ocean Racing Circuit. I immediately wrote a letter to George Cuthbertson. George and I had spoken previously about my wanting to be a yacht designer. He was very much the opinion to become a yacht designer, you had to work in a boat building plant. So he got me a job for the summer of 1968, working in the custom plant with Eric Bruckman. And in that plant were Manitou and True North and Bagatelle boats being prepared for the 1969 Canada's Cup. And then the next summer, George let me work in the design office. And then after that, I started full time, took some time off to get my master's and came back. And so my whole presence in this photograph is due to Red Jacket. And Rob Ball, standing here, Steve Killing next to him, next to me on the other side, can say the same thing. And Mark Ellis came up from the US, working for Ted Hood, before that with Phil Rhodes, and then the Hunt Design Office before that. And he came up because of Red Jacket, because of Red Jacket's success. This design office in 1973 was, unbeknownst to Rob, Steve, and myself, was probably the top design office in North America right now. The 1972 SORC had been exceptionally successful for the CNC group. So what's the importance of Red Jacket, and where does she fit into all this, other than my own personal history? And the word I stumbled on really is that Red Jacket was a nexus. She was a connection linking two things. The two things she connected was the yacht design and building world prior to 1967, 1968 in Ontario, which was basically a cottage industry. You had small designers and small builders building boats for local people. They didn't have any national or international range. After Red Jacket in 1967, 68, the whole industry blew open in Canada and in Ontario specifically, with the creation of CNC yachts and the creation of a Canadian yacht building industry. And all the advancements in Red Jacket from a composites point of view also took off. Cord laminate construction became the norm in offshore racing yachts, and became the norm in all high-end composite construction. If anybody was watching the America's Cup this year, all those boats that were flying off foils, none of those were aluminum or steel or wood. They were all high-end cord composite construction, and all that started with Red Jacket. And the other significance of Red Jacket, of course, is her victories occurred in 1967 and 1968, which were Canadian Centennial Year, Expo 67. So Red Jacket was being successful at a time when national pride was already at a fever pitch. So everything came together for Red Jacket in 1967 and 68. And I keep talking about Red Jacket's SORC wins in 67 and 68, and most people know that as being Red Jacket's fame and claim to notoriety, if you like. She did very well in those years. And the names George Cuthbertson, George Cassian, and Perry Connolly are associated with Red Jacket because of that. And you can look at that and say that Red Jacket was an overnight success, that she basically came out of the blue and went down to Florida and out of the frozen north and started winning races. But what I'm going to talk about today is all the hard work, the 20 years of effort that went into the creation of what would become Red Jacket. I think it was Malcolm Gladwell said you have to donate 10,000 hours to any enterprise before you become successful. And what we're going to see tonight is that Cuthbertson and Cassian and Perry Connolly and all those people devoted far more than 10,000 hours to what would become Red Jacket. And the fourth person in this whole Red Jacket story is her builder, Eric Bruckman. Red Jacket would exist only on paper if it wasn't for somebody to actually take that concept on paper and turn it into reality. And Eric Bruckman was the person to do that. There would be no Red Jacket without Eric Bruckman. And as I say, I interviewed all these people while they're still with us, very fortunate. And I asked Eric specifically, he was one of the first people I interviewed. I asked him, well, how did it all start, Eric? Where did it all start? And he said, what, being CNC yachts? And I said, no, even before that. Where did it all start? And he looked at me and said, well, it all started with George, of course. Everything started with George. So that's where we're going to start tonight. I'm going to start with George Cuthbertson. This is a photo of George when he was 17 years old at the dock at the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. He was born in 1929 in Brantford, Ontario. His father unfortunately passed away when George was only 12 years old, so the family moved to Toronto to be closer to his mother's family. And so, but George had, from a very early age, been obsessed with sailboats. He had no background in sailing. The family had no background in sailing. He, to this day, does not know where that obsession came from, but he was obsessed with sailboats. And so he, when he moved to Toronto, he just prowled the waterfront, to be quite honest. He went to the J.J. Taylor's, applied for a job, and he stumbled on a builder in Mimico called Saco Marine. And he found a fellow by the name of Dick Telford, who put him to work repairing an old C-class boat called Cricket. And it was, as George said, it was a match made in heaven. Here he was being unpaid to repair a boat. He was happy. Dick Telford was happy. And then during this time, he was designing boats as well. Here, this is an excerpt from Boating Magazine of 1944 when he was 15 years old. And this is a design contest, and he submitted this design, and it was published. So he's at he's at Royal Canadian Yacht Club. He's part of the junior club. He starts late in the junior club, but rapidly becomes a top sailor. He's awarded the Silver Burgee. He becomes, at 19 years old, the chief measurer at the yacht club. He starts racing 6 meters quite competitively. He graduates in mechanical engineering from the University of Toronto. He starts a company called Canadian Northern with another friend that he'd met at Royal Canadian Yacht Club, Peter Davidson. And this company called Canadian Northern was building early fiberglass sailboats, an 8-foot water rat dinghy to George's design. He becomes friendly with Perry Connolly at this time as well, because they're both sailing with Norm Walsh on Norm Walsh's Evangeline, which is a boat built by Sackow Marine, designed by Dick Telford. So all these people were coming together at this early age. And through Norm Walsh, George becomes involved in 8 meters, because Norm had Evangeline, which was smaller than 8 meters, but racing 8s. So he said, why don't I just buy an 8 meter instead of racing against it with another boat? So he buys Invader 2, an old 8 meter from the 1930s. He asks George to optimize it. George, being the club measurer, is familiar with what makes boats go fast nowadays, and he suggests that they do some rig modifications, which meant buying all new sails. And as George told me, nothing makes a boat as fast as buying all new sails. And so with the modifications that George made, Invader cleaned up at RCYC against the other 8 meters that year. So Norm turned to young George and to his partner, Peter Davidson, both of who were sailing at RCYC on the 8s, and said, well, what's next? What do we do now? And they looked at Norm and said, well, you know, the Canada's Cup hasn't been raced for since the 1930s and hasn't been won by RCYC since 1907. Why don't we challenge for the Canada's Cup? So they got the club on board and they challenged for the Canada's Cup. Norm said, well, I've already got an 8 meter, we'll use that. And George said, well, no, that 8 meters lost 2 previous challenges in the 1930s. We can do better than that. So they went out and George got Venture from Detroit, did what he did on Invader, put a new mast in it, new sails, stripped her out, made her lighter, and they went to Rochester and they beat the American defender Iskareen 3-1 with Dave Howard here sailing Venture. Dave Howard was recently inducted into the Canadian Sailing Hall of Fame. Norm Walsh, I talked to George about Norm, and George said Norm didn't have any children of his own, so George felt that Norm looked upon him, George, as a son. And since George had lost his father when he was 12 years old, and George didn't say this, but I have to think that he looked upon Norm as a father figure as well. But Norm was extremely influential in George's life, and specifically after winning the Canada's Cup. He turned to George and said, well, let's do something different. Let's do an offshore racer. And he asked George Cuthbertson, 25-year-old George Cuthbertson, to design a 53-foot CCA offshore racer. Now, George had 2 boats built to his designs at this time. He had the 8-foot water rat dinghy, which Canadian Northern was building in fiberglass, and he had a 24-foot plywood boat, sailboat, built to his design. But Norm said, we're going to do a 53-foot ocean racer. They went down to City Island. They looked at Carina, the top ocean racer at the time, designed by Phil Rhodes. They came back. George started designer. At this point, George commits to becoming a designer full time. They moved from their facilities at Port Credit Boat Works. George gets a design office on Front Street, or on Lakeshore Avenue in Port Credit. And Dick Telford, who we met earlier through Sackow Marine, becomes the overseer of construction of what would become Innisfree at the Cliff Richardson Yard up in Meaford. Project starts in 1956, but the boat's not finished until 1958. Meanwhile, because she's in the works, George starts getting other design contracts. He designs Galatea for Tony Ronza and the LCD for the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. So all this design work starts now coming in, and George becomes a full-time designer. And Innisfree, when she's launched, does exceptionally well. Wins the Freeman Cup on the lakes with David Howard, who was sailed in the 8 meters as a sailing master. George sails aboard her to do the Bermuda race in 1960, I believe. So George is now a full-time yacht designer because of Norm and Innisfree. And the company, Canadian Northern, CN, is now also importing boats from Europe. George was importing 6 meters, competitive 6 meters, and he discovered this builder in the Friesland Islands, north of Germany, and it was the CN35 he started importing from Kurt Beister. The CN35, the first 6 were built by Beister. The next 6 were built by Cliff Richardson up in Meaford, because the industry was out of the shop, and the shop was available to build those boats. And these boats were welded steel. And actually, any RHYC listeners out there, people watching, George Overend's, or Dr. Overend's boat was a CN35 back then. But the CN35 not only was bringing money into this fledgling company, Canadian Northern, because of the brokerage business, but it was introducing George to some significant individuals. The purchaser of hull number 1, Sava was the boat's name, was Ian Morch. Ian and George had gone to school together at U of T in engineering. Ian was now running a metal fabrication business in Belleville for the aircraft industry, and he buys hull number 1. Ian Morch would found Belleville Marine, which would become part of CNC Yachts. And hull number, one of the early Richardson boats, number 6, I think, and maybe number 9, we're not sure, was bought by Perry Connolly. Perry Connolly had been part of that group with Peter Davidson and George at the very beginning. He'd actually married Peter Davidson's sister. So this is how close a group that was. And Perry Connolly had left sailing for a while to start his own company, a contracting company. And he was building Holiday Inns all through Ontario. And he was doing very well. And now he came back into sailing, came back to his friend George Cuthbertson, and bought Carousel, the CN35, and did extremely well with her on Lake Ontario, racing on Lake Ontario. And George figures that Connolly racing Carousel contributed a lot to the success of Red Jacket, because as George said, the CN35s were pretty, but they weren't very fast. And so Connolly had to sail to top-notch performance to make to accumulate the race wins he did. And George, the analogy George used was, he said, Perry sailing Carousel was like a batter swinging 2 bats before he steps up to the plate, then puts 1 bat down and hits a home run. And the home run, of course, was Red Jacket many years later. And while all this was going on, the CN35s were coming in. Industry had just been launched 1958. 1959, a young draftsman by the name of George Cassian comes knocking on George Cuthbertson's door looking for a job. Cassian had been part of the Avro Arrow project in Downsview, where they're designing this Canadian fighter jet. Diefenbaker had put a stop to the production of the Avro Arrow, and overnight 17,000 people were unemployed. Majority of those, a lot of those went down to NASA. But George Cassian was a sailor out of the Toronto Sailing and Canoe Club. He came knocking on George Cuthbertson's door. George said, well, I've got about 2 weeks work right now, so we'll see how it works out. He stayed for a year, and then Cassian went down to Detroit for a year to try his stint in the automotive industry, came back in 1961 and joined George Cuthbertson full-time, at which point they created in 1961 the design firm of Cuthbertson and Cassian. Peter Davidson at this time, part of CN, Canadian Northern, had gone to the States to become a sailmaker, and so George dissolved Canadian Northern and started up Cuthbertson and Cassian. And one of their earliest successes in 1959, the year that George Cassian joined them, was a boat called Venatus, designed for Payson Mayhew in Chicago. And this boat was significant in a number of ways. It was built in steel, like the CN35s, and it was built by Beisner, the same as the CN35s, as was Galatea before that. But it went to Chicago. It was the first boat he designed off Lake Ontario. And it went to Chicago and did very well. It did so well that Payson Mayhew took it down to the Southern Ocean Racing Circuit in 1961 and raced the circuit. And George sailed with them. And George, to George's recollection, that was probably the first time a Canadian had sailed the SORC. But more importantly, in the crew of Venetis was another contractor, developer, this time from Chicago, called Jim McHugh. And Jim McHugh was so impressed with Venetis's performance at the SORC that he asked George to design a boat for himself, and that was Inferno 2. And I'm going to talk about that in a little while. But again, meanwhile, while all this was going on, and they're building these steel boats out of Bicester, and they just built Innisfree in wood, the Cliff Richardsons. Metro Marine was starting up in Bronte, and the Metro Marine shed is still there in Bronte Harbor. It's now being declared a historic building by the city of Oakville. And Metro Marine was building strip planked boats to George Cuthbertson's design. This is a pintail. They had this is about, I guess, 25 feet long, designed for Marty Teal out of Rochester, and they built about 6 pintails. And the principals involved in Metro Marine were Eric Bruckman, standing right here, Horst Mansell, Brian Jorgensen, standing right there, and Johnny Walker. Eric was an Austrian immigrant, literally just off the boat. This was his first job. When he applied for work at Metro Marine, he didn't know how to speak English. Horst Mansell was a German immigrant, literally just off the boat. Brian Jorgensen was Danish, and Johnny Walker was English. So you got the sort of United Nations of immigrants who would go on to form the backbone of the Canadian boating industry at this time. Now, the method they're using to build these boats is strip planked cedar, edge grained, edge nailed, and glued with aerolite glue. And what they're trying to do here is create a monocoque construction, a one-piece hull. Most wooden boats, all wooden boats up to that time, were made up of planks held together with ribs in a system that had been developed hundreds of years ago. And so this was actually trying to bring wooden boat building into the 20th century by creating a one-piece hull glued together. This is, still done with cedar strip canoes, but that's about it. Fiberglass construction basically obsoleted this whole technique. Two of the early projects of Metro Marine were La Mouette in 1960, designed for Gordon Fisher, who's going to play a prominent part in this story, and Pipe Dream. Pipe Dream and La Mouette were built at the same time. Pipe Dream was built for Sonny Sleeman. Pipe Dream actually was a collaboration between Dick Telford and George Cuthbertson. It was a motor sailor. The only motor sailor George ever designed was actually a Dick Telford design, and she still exists, of course. La Mouette still exists. She's on the on Long Island Sound. But during this time, Metro Marine was building these strip plank boats, being built by Eric Bruckman, supervisor of the plant, and using a technique that Dick Telford had developed called the inside-out method of boat building. And this is a good example. This is Pipe Dream with her entire interior installed. You can see she's got the V-berth cushions in there already. This is for obviously a bit of an open house, but the whole purpose of the inside-out technique was to build a boat completely, put everything in it, electrical systems, mechanical systems, plumbing and everything. And then the last thing you did was close the hull. And that was a very successful way of building boats at that time. And I mentioned Pipe Dream, of course. Margaret Mary and Joan Brennan own Pipe Dream now, and she is in immaculate condition. This is where, as she appeared at the Classic Boat Show in Clayton, New York, where she won the first prize in her class. But so here we are. Cuthbertson and Cassian are a going entity at this time, designing boats. Jim McHugh, who had sailed with George on Venetis and the SORC, Jim McHugh, so impressed, he orders a boat for his own, and that's Inferno 1, 1962. And she's built in Florida in the strip plank method, and it's actually built by Dick Telford, because Dick Telford has moved to Florida at this time to design for Bertram and Chris Craft and a bunch of builders down there. But he builds this boat for George, and she comes back up to Chicago. And on the way to Chicago, she stops off in Toronto and wins the Prince of Wales Trophy in 1965. And then Gordon Fisher, who had La Mouette, reappears in the picture and orders Thermopylae in 1964. And he wants the top ocean racer on Lake, well, offshore racer on Lake Ontario. And this is, all these boats are designed to the CCA rule, of course. And the CCA rule was the dominant rule for design at that time. And she's launched, and she does very well. But this is the last boat that Metro Marine builds, because Eric at that time leaves Metro Marine, says, Eric's a cabinet maker by profession. I asked Eric how much training he had in Germany or in Austria before he came to Canada in boat building. And he said, none. I've had no training in boat building. He said, maybe I shouldn't say that, he said, but I have no training in boat building. And he learned everything about boat building at Metro Marine. So at that time, there's a whole bunch of apartment buildings going up in Burlington. And somebody approached Eric to install all the kitchens in these apartment buildings. So he quit boat building, so he thought, and he took Horst and Brian with him, and they were installing kitchens in these apartment buildings going up. And then George Cuthbertson reached out again, pulled Eric back into boat building to have him put the interior into Ray Ingholm's aluminum Ivanhoe 3, George Cuthbertson design. Ingholm was building the hull and deck himself, needed somebody to put the interior in. George convinced Eric to build the interior for Ivanhoe. That brought Eric back into boat building. So here we are, 1965. And the three principals in this company called Cuthbertson and Cassian are George Cuthbertson, of course, George Cassian, of course, and John Byrne. And we haven't spoken about John Byrne to date, but this is actually from a brochure that Cuthbertson and Cassian put out in 1966, announcing their skills and accomplishments. And this is the first time John Byrne appears as part of Cuthbertson and Cassian. And John Byrne is interesting because the reason Red Jacket was built in fiberglass is because of John Byrne. John Byrne was another immigrant from England, like Johnny Walker. He became enamored with fiberglass fairly early because he had friends in the aircraft industry and in the fabric industry. And they were talking about fiberglass. Then he meets up with a guy by the name of Jim Bissiker. And Jim Bissiker is also a contractor. He's building things, and he has to lay off his crew every winter because they can't pour concrete in the winter back then. So he's looking for something for his guys to do during the winter. And John says, have you thought about fiberglass? And Bissinger said, I don't know anything about fiberglass, do you? And John Byrne says, well, I can find out. So he went and worked for a year at the Anchorage in Rhode Island, working for Bill Dyer. And Bill Dyer, and he lived with Bill Dyer while he was doing this and sailed with him on weekends. And Bill Dyer taught him how to build a fiberglass boat. He came back to Oakville, Ontario. He and Bissinger formed a company called Grampian Marine, building early fiberglass boats. And you'll notice that the description of John Byrne when he was hired and being promoted here is fiberglass consultant and yacht broker second. Anybody who knows John Byrne now by name remembers him as a yacht broker, a very successful one. But he was hired by Cuthbertson and Cassian because of his fiberglass expertise. Because, as Mike Dale would attest, at that time, 1965, George Cuthbertson had the orders for 3 large boats, Red Jacket, Inferno 2, and Xanadu, and they didn't have anybody to build them at that time. And they needed some fiberglass expertise. So before we get back into the construction, let's talk about Red Jacket's design. You know, the story of her origins is almost as legendary as Red Jacket herself. Perry Connolly had been racing carousel for the last 4 years. and Thermopylae appeared on the scene. George Cuthbertson and Perry Connolly were close friends. They'd known each other for many years. Connolly had season tickets to the Toronto Maple Leafs. They went to a hockey game. It won late in 1965, sorry. And between, as George tells it, between the second and third period, they started talking about building a new boat, because as Connolly told me when I'd interviewed him, he just got tired of looking at Thermopylae's transom for the whole year. And so he turned to George and said, I want you to design me the meanest, hungriest 40-footer afloat. And that was the origin of the design contract. Well, no contract, handshake deal to design a boat for Perry Connolly that would beat Thermopylae. That was the goal, to beat Thermopylae. And the origin of the name Red Jacket signals that quite concisely. Because Thermopylae was named after a famous British tea clipper, Thermopylae, that used to race tea from India, Ceylon to England, and was as the fastest clipper on the water. So Connolly named his boat Red Jacket, named another clipper that was going to beat Connolly's Thermopylae. So it's a good time actually there for, good to compare the designs of Thermopylae, 1964, George Cuthbertson and Cassian, to 1965, Red Jacket, Cuthbertson and Cassian. And, as Michelle said, all these drawings, by the way, are in the Cuthbertson and Scenes of Yachts collection at the Marine Museum. And the first thing you notice in the design, obviously, is the change from full keel to fin keel and spade rudder in Red Jacket. That's the obvious difference. But when you look a little more subtly at the design as well, you'll notice that Thermopylae is almost 41.5 feet long, bow to stern, and Red Jacket is a little under 40 feet, 39 foot 8 inches bow to stern. She's going to have a bowsprit, so that's going to extend the rig somewhat. But Red Jacket is, a good 1.5 feet shorter than Thermopylae. But then you look at the waterline lengths. Thermopylae has a waterline of 27.5 feet. Red Jacket has a waterline 30 feet, 2.5 feet longer for a slightly shorter hull. You look at the displacements. Thermopylae is 17,800 pounds. Red Jacket is about 18,000 pounds. I got this displacement off a CCA certificate, by the way. And more importantly, on that displacement on that waterline, you get a displacement length ratio of 382, which by modern standards is cruising boat. Red Jacket on a longer waterline and the same displacement has a displacement length ratio of 298. Heavy by modern standards, but in those days that was a very lightweight boat. So what George has done here, in addition to going to a fin keel and spade rudder, he stretched the boat and made it longer on the waterline and given it greater potential speed, because speed is related to the waterline. And what George pointed out when I talked to him, he said Red Jacket was not designed as a rule beater. That's why he went for the longer waterline. She actually did not rate well under CCA. And the whole purpose of a rating rule, of course, is the boats at this time did not race boat for boat. They raced on corrected time. They take the time of the finish and they adjust the finish time based on the rating difference between the two boats. And so it was most yacht designers tried to design boats that were favorable to a specific rule. Red Jacket was not favorable to the CCA. CCA rule was not favorable to Red Jacket, so she had to sail to her performance. And the fin keel, most people look at Red Jacket as very innovative because she had a fin keel. But keep in mind, the fin keel was invented in 1891 by Nathaniel Hershoff. And that was the same year he designed Gloriana. And Hershoff had just come into yacht design, designing to the what was then the Sewanaka rule, sail area and water length rule. And he designed Gloriana, which was a pure rule beater, changed the face of yacht design from there on. He designed Dilemma, which was a rule beater because she was a very short water line. good stability because of the fin keel, and very good performance and very light displacement. And Dilemma, this picture of Dilemma, by the way, was taken at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. She still exists. She's in that museum. And anybody who's been to RCYC and seen the models of the Canada's Cup racers, when I first saw this model several years ago, I almost fell over. Here's a fin keel model from 1901, Invader, which was the same name, by the way, as Norm Walsh's 8-meter, which was Invader 2, but from 1901. And in the type of Canada's Cup, the boat that Canada raced against in 1896 was also a fin keeler, Vencedor. But from this date on, all new rating rules, the universal rule and the international rule, their sole purpose was to eliminate the fin keel. They did it by girth measurements. They did it by regulations. CCA was the same. The whole purpose was to get rid of the fin keel, and that was very successful until about 1963. The fin keel came back in 1963 with the Cal 40. Bill Lapworth's design, launched in 1963. In 1964, the Cal 40 wins SORC and wins the Transpac. So the fin keel starts making its reappearance in yacht racing. And that's in 1965, Dick Carter launches a boat called Rabbit, which wins the Fastnet, and that too was a fin keeler. So when George designed Red Jacket, he was on the leading edge because fin keels were just coming in. And in actual fact, Red Jacket wasn't even his first fin keel design. Red Jacket was design number 6513, which meant it was his 13th design in 1965. Design number 65-8 was the Grampian Marine Classic 22. And it was a fin keel. So George was already thinking about fin keels prior to Red Jacket. And of course, the Classic 22 was built by Grampian Marine. And that's the connection between John Byrne and Cuthbertson and Cassian. John Byrne left Grampian Marine at this time and joined Cuthbertson and Cassian when the Classic 22 was being developed at Grampian Marine. So that's the design of Red Jacket. Avant-garde, fin keel, lighter displacement, stretched in length to get a longer waterline, and an obsessive consideration of weight, especially weight in the ends. She had the interior of an 8-meter, no quarter berths, and nothing forward of the mast except the head. And even when she raced in the SORC, she was criticized as being too stripped out at that time. And nowadays she's considered somewhat palatial, but back then she was considered a stripped out ocean racer. And that was another trend she started. But the construction of Red Jacket was as pioneering as her design because she was built in cored composite construction. Here's the first hull built in North America that had a core. And a core, basically, if you look at this, is a layer of glass on either side of a balsa core. And this is a sample piece from the Baltec Corporation. This is the same amount of glass on a core and then going to a single skin. And you can see, of course, it's very stiff with the core and very flexible without the core. And that's what core does. It adds stiffness to the laminate with no increase in weight, essentially. And it creates what we were talking about before, a monocoque construction. And composite construction would eventually replace everything else on the race course, and Red Jacket was leading the way. But I should say that Cuthbertson and Cassian had already developed experience even previous to John Byrne with fiberglass construction, because they designed a boat called the Invader 3. We already saw Invader 8-meter, we saw the Invader Canada's Cup boat. Now this is an Invader called Invader 3 for George Hinterholer in 1963. George had started fiberglass construction with the Shark in 1960, the very early 1960s, and the Shark was also a fin keel boat, and so also pioneering this design trend. But they were designing. The Invader was the first boat that Cuthbertson and Cassian designed in fiberglass for George Hinterholer. And you can see here in the design, she is a full keel boat, as the majority of CCA type racers were back then. So where did this concept of chord construction come from? Well, it came 20 years before in the de Havilland Mosquito fighter bomber, the plane known as the Wooden Wonder. It was built entirely in wood, except for the engine mounts and the landing gear. Everything else was laminated wood. And it was built by the de Havilland Aircraft Company in England, and it was built in de Havilland Aircraft in Downsview, Ontario. They built 1,000 of these planes at that time in Downsview. And at the time the Mosquito was first flown in 1941, it was the fastest airplane in the world. It could top 400 miles an hour. The Spitfire could only do 370 miles an hour at that point. And it was built entirely in wood, and it was built in chord construction. And this is a photograph of a Mosquito being built in New Zealand. Not many Mosquitoes survived the war. There's one in Calgary. There's two. You go on the website, you can go down this whole rabbit hole of Mosquito construction, and some superb videos. And there's one being built in Calgary, and these are being built in New Zealand. And the Mosquito was built on these male plugs. You can see them here, and they're built in two halves. And they laid up laminations of wood, birch plywood, on these plugs, and they arranged the grain to be optimum in the strength they wanted, because the grain, of course, determines the strength of the wood. And they laminated the grain in plus or minus 45s and 90 degrees. And then they laid in the balsa core. It was flat grain balsa at that time. And then they laminated more birch ply on top of that, glued it all together with a new glue, with a 2-part uraformaldehyde glue called Aerolite, which is the same glue that are using at Metro Marine to build those strip plank boats. And this was the first application of a structural chord composite of wood and balsa core. And it was so important, balsa core was so important to the war effort, specifically because of the Mosquito fighter bomber, that it was declared a strategic material by all the Allied forces in England, Canada, and the U.S. And it got top priority in production. And the company was producing that was a company called Balsa Ecuador. And the advantage of this chord construction, the Mosquito, was it eliminated all the frames. Aluminum aircraft were masses of interior frames with a lightweight aluminum skin. The chord construction on the Mosquito meant you didn't need any interior framing at all. It was a pure monocoque stressed skin construction. And it was extremely successful. And as I say, Balsa Ecuador became very prominent in the wartime effort, because they're exporting all this balsa to build the Mosquito, and they're using it for Carly floats and things like that as well. But Mosquito was the primary use of balsa core. But then the war ended, of course, and then this company in Baltic called Balsa Ecuador was looking for a new market for core materials, and they discovered the boating business. And Everett Pearson of Pearson Yachts specifically is credited working with Baltic Corporation, a fellow by the name of Alec LePay at Baltic, and they went from flat grain balsa, as they used the Mosquito, to end grain balsa, which meant it had higher shear and compressive strengths. And Everett Pearson started using it in Pearson Yachts in the decks, and balsa core became the prominent core material in decks to get lightweight, stiff core material. But then it came time to build Red Jacket. And here's Alec LePay out there promoting core materials for Baltic. Here you have John Byrne insisting that these 3 boats that they had orders for, Red Jacket, Xanadu, and Inferno, had to be built in fiberglass. And they brought Eric Bruckman back they brought back Eric Bruckman back into the boating business to build these 3 boats specifically. And remember, Eric had never built a fiberglass boat before in his entire life. He wanted these boats to be built in strip plank wood because that's what he knew how to do. But John Byrne and Alec LePay and George Cuthbertson convinced Eric Bruckman to start building in glass. And they got the fiberglass crews from Grampian Marine to come down. Eric rented space in a factory that was available, Halliday Homes in Burlington, and they started building Red Jacket on a male plug, just like the Mosquitoes. Fuselages were built. They laid down the first inside layer of skin. They laid down the core on top of that skin, and then they laid the outside layer of glass on top of the core, just like the Mosquito fighter bomber. And they were hedging their bets, though. This is the first time they'd done this, the first time anybody had done this in the marine industry. So they hedged their bets. And in order to carry the chain plate loading, chain plates on the original boat were on the hull sides, and they had this solid fiberglass strapping throughout the core in order to take the loads from the chain plates right down to the mast step and the keel structure. This is the only time they did that. When they built Inferno, they did not do this anymore, but they were hedging their bets because they're breaking new ground with this new technology. And they moved Red Jacket. They started Red Jacket actually at Halliday Homes. During construction, they shipped it off to a building that Eric had just obtained for himself on Spears Road, which would become later the CNC retail operation. And they finished her in there, and she was launched in May of 1966. And I should say, Eric told me he was offered a $1,000 bonus by Perry Connolly if he finished Red Jacket before the scheduled launch date. He didn't. In actual fact, she was a week late. And he said, Perry still paid me that $1,000. So that's and Perry told me actually was, and all of this was done on handshakes. Perry had no involvement in the choice of material, the design of the boat. He said he left it entirely to Eric and to George and George on what the boat should look like. His only involvement was helping to lay out the decks, the location of winches and whatnot. And that was his only involvement. And he had no contract with the designers, no contract with the builders, and he just let them do their own thing. And it was a time and material contract. And so May of 1966, she's trucked down to Bronte Harbor for her launch. Everybody's dressed up in their nines for a launch, of course. And she's hoisted on the crane. That's Eric Bruckman standing right there with the rope ready for her launching. That's Horst Mansell. As I mentioned, all those guys from Metro Marine, Horst and Brian, came with Eric with his various companies. Johnny Walker, by the way, went to Nova Scotia and helped build Balloonos, which was being built at this time, as an aside. And here's the 2 designers, young George Cassian, still young, barely 40, I guess, George Cuthbertson, with Perry Connolly's daughter, Sheila, and Eric Bruckman, the builder, with his shirt hanging out, ready for the christening of the boat. And there's young Sheila holding the bottle of champagne, and wham, bullseye. She breaks the bottle on the boat first try, which is a good omen for any boat. And Red Jacket is launched, and much to everyone's relief, especially the designers, of course, she's floating on her lines and floating level. And that's Eric and Horst back here steering her to Metro Marine, where they actually started their boat building career. They're storing her. This is in Bronte Creek, at the home of Metro Marine. So all of this is all coming together at this time. She's launched. She actually does badly in her first race, the Susan Hood, still the first race of the season. She did badly, but after that, she won 11 of her next 12 starts, including the Prince of Wales race. Jim McHugh, who had commissioned Inferno 1, brought Inferno 1 back in 1966 to defend his 1965 win of the Prince of Wales Cup. And he loses it to Red Jacket. Red Jacket beats them for the Prince of Wales, and they're on the veranda at the Royal Canadian Yacht Club, Jim McHugh and Perry Connolly. And Perry Connolly designed this boat purely to beat Thermopylae racing on Lake Ontario. And Jim McHugh says, this boat needs to go south for the SORC. Perry Connolly had no idea what the SORC was, but Jim McHugh, who had sailed SORC on Venetus, convinced Connolly to take the boat to the SORC. McHugh arranged to have the boat trucked himself. He was so keen on it. And he committed that he would sail on it himself with Perry, and he would supply half the crew. That's how keen he was on this boat going to the SORC. So they trucked the boat down. She appears out of the blue at SORC, enters the first race, which is the Venice race. It's I think it's an 80-mile course from St. Petersburg to Venice. Her first ever saltwater race. She's been racing a season in freshwater. First saltwater race with people who hadn't sailed her before. Half the crew, including Jim McHugh, had never sailed her before. And she wins the Venice race, first race of the SORC. People took notice. There was an article in the New York Times about it. And so our people are saying, this is a flash in the pan. This is a lucky break. Did she, this boat that nobody knew anything about? Well, the next race in the SORC is the St. Pete's to Fort Lauderdale race. It counts 35% of the results. It's a long distance race. And lo and behold, she finishes second in that race. This proves that she's not just a flash in the pan. And I should point out, actually, this is 1967 SORC. This is the first time a Canadian-designed boat has raced the SORC. There are two other Canadian boats in the series. Kurt Hansen had Dushka 4, which was an Allberg 37 of his own that he had built at Whitby Boatworks, racing the SORC, and a Royal Hamilton Yacht Club boat, my own club. John Essery had an S&S design called Crossbow, racing the SORC. So there were three Canadian boats, but only Red Jacket was the only Canadian designed boat that was racing the SORC that year. First Canadian designed boat to ever race the SORC. So I said she was first in the Venice race, second overall in the St. Pete Lauderdale race, and then goes in the Lipton Cup, and she is first overall in the Lipton Cup. She is leading the fleet. She's first place by a good margin. The next race is the Miami-Nassau race, which is the other long distance race after the St. Pete's race, and it's rated 35% of the results is based on that race. And she has a disastrous Miami-Nassau race. She goes the wrong way, gets stuck in a hole. She finishes 23rd in fleet. Still a respectable finish, but it drops it down substantially on the overall results because that race is worth 35% of the results. She has a pretty good Nassau Cup, finishes 6th, but not enough to win SORC and not even enough to win class. She finishes second in class to a boat she had beaten 4 times out of 5. She had beaten this boat 4 times out of 5, but the boat had beat her in the by a substantial margin in the Miami-Nassau race, and therefore eked out a win in class. So she still, the world took notice. She had a very respectable finish, and being from a designer nobody had ever heard of, from builder nobody had ever heard of, she beat the cream of the crop in American offshore racing. So she came back to Ontario, raced that year. But meanwhile, Inferno 2 for Jim McHugh was launched. Same place, Bronte Pier, same place Red Jacket was launched the year before. And Eric had finished actually a boat before Inferno. He finished Xanadu, a boat for a Montreal owner, a cruising boat. And then he built Inferno and dropped her in the water, launched her. And this is a picture of Eric Bruckman, George Cuthbertson, George Cassian, and Mr. and Mrs. McHugh on Inferno. and they're going to plan to race the SORC. She tunes up on Lake Ontario, races 8 meters because that's the only thing on Lake Ontario that even comes close to her in speed. And but she would race the SORC in 1968 as well. And because of Red Jacket's success, Eric Bruckman, while he's building Inferno, also embarks on building a production, quote unquote, production version of Red Jacket. Perry Connolly wouldn't let them build a boat. He wouldn't let them take a mold off Red Jacket. He wanted Red Jacket to be a custom one-off. But her success was so prominent, people were asking for Red Jacket-like designs. And so Cuthbertson and Cassian and Bruckman got together and produced a Redline 41. And the owner of Redline 41, #1, was John Odenbach from Rochester. And he named the boat Rampage. Odenbach would be later more famous for the CNC 43 called Rampage. But the first Rampage from Cuthbertson and Cassian and Bruckman was the Redline 41. And he would take that boat to SORC as well. And a Redline 41, just as an aside, would win SORC in 1972 overall. So in the 1968 SORC, you have 4 Cuthbertson and Cassian boats racing. You've got Red Jacket returning, this time with an all-Canadian crew. You've got Inferno coming down with Jim McHugh from Chicago. You got Rampage from Rochester, an American boat, first the Redline 41s. And you've got a little 31-foot Corvette being built by Belleville Marine, Ian Morch. His first production boat is the Cuthbertson and Cassian design Corvette, and she makes her appearance at SORC as well. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Now, the SORC, as in the previous year, 1968, involved 6 races, 5 of which were to count. You know, we talked about the St. Pete Venice race, which counts for 15%. It's an 80-mile race. St. Pete Lauderdale race counts for 35%. The Miami West End race, 15%, Lipton Cup, Miami Nassau, Nassau Cup, etc. And you could race either the St. Pete's or the West End race. You could only count one of them. You couldn't count both. And so that was to favor or to help boats that were racing only on the east coast of Florida. Rampage, for instance, and the Corvette came down and only did the last half of SORC on the east coast of Florida. So here, Red Jacket comes down. She's no longer an unknown entity now. She done very well in 1967. So she comes down again and she wins the. She does well in the Venice race. I think she finished 7th in the Venice race. She doesn't win it, but then she goes into the Lauderdale race and she wins the Lauderdale race overall. A lot of races worth 35% of the results. She does well in the Venice race. She wins a Lauderdale race. She races the West End race, does 7th in class, about the same as she did in the Venice race. And so she's standing in pretty good position right now overall. And that takes her into the next race, which is the Lipton Cup race off Miami. And it turns out to be a lightish air race, and just like Lake Ontario, basically. And she ends up winning the Lipton Cup by going away. She wins 10 minutes. Wins her 10-minute time allowance on the next closest competitor. She wins first in class, wins first overall, and she's 8th boat to finish in a 90-boat fleet. And she beats the majority of the A-class boats who started 5 minutes in front of her. She does exceptionally well. In addition to that, Rampage, the Redline 41, finishes 3rd in Class B. Red Jacket's 1st in Class B. Rampage is 3rd in Class B, and I think 6th overall. And the little Electra also does well in the Lipton Cup, and then they also do exceptionally well in the Miami Nassau race that follows. In the Miami-Nassau race, she wins the Miami-Nassau race, the race that actually had scuppered her in 1967, and Rampage and the Corvette also do well in the Miami-Nassau race. So things are looking very well for CNC yachts at this point, going into the last race, which is the Lipton Cup, which is the Nassau Cup at that point, which she in turn wins overall. So here's the Miami-Nassau race, which she wins, and she does very well. I think she does very well in the last race, and that she wins the Nassau Cup basically. And going into the Nassau Cup, she had things sewn up so dramatically that she would have had to have been beaten by her next closest competitor by 23 positions, I think, to lose it. And she actually beats that next closest competitor by 10 positions. So she wins the SORC in 1968 by going away. She basically runs the board with SORC, the first Canadian yacht and the first non-American yacht to win the SORC. The world definitely takes notice of Cuthbertson and Cassian, Eric Bruckman, and fiberglass, cord fiberglass construction. This is a picture of Connolly accepting the governor's trophy from the Governor General of the Bahamas. And you know, I'm sure he filled it with champagne. There's celebration all around. Picture of the crew, and the people in the crew to notice, of course, are here we have David Osler, Gordon Fisher, who had Thermopylae and La Mouette, now sailing with Perry Connolly on Red Jacket, and this is the professional Peter McKinnon, and the only American on board actually was a navigator, who was Bill West. He had navigated the previous SORC, and Connolly wanted somebody who knew Florida waters. And Jack Beatson would actually become prominent. I knew Jack very well. He became an IOR measurer and sailed a lot of SORC boats. And the people not shown in this picture were George Cassian, who raced on Red Jacket during the series. Denny Draper from my own RHYC raced on this series as well, and ended up buying a Redline 41 called Bedlam. And Huey McGill, I sailed with a lot. He was part of this crew. John Rothwell, who Mark Ellis knows from Non-Such Days, was part of this crew. And I think even David Howard was part of this crew. So all the prominent yachtsmen in Canada were part of this and RCYC anyway, and Hamilton were part of this Red Jacket crew. And we talked about the Corvette. And the Corvette is interesting, not only because I own one, which of course is quite significant, but the Corvette in this series had on board George Cuthbertson, George Hinnerholer, and Ian Morch, all of whom would become founding members of CNC Yachts. As you can imagine what the off-watch discussion was sailing the Corvette in the last races of the SORC. And the person sailing the Corvette Electra, is not in this picture, was Bruce Kirby. And Bruce Kirby, at this time in 1967 and 1968, was a yachting journalist. He was the editor of One Design and Offshore Yachtsman. And he wrote prominently about Cuthbertson and Cassian and yacht racing in general. And at this time, he was designing international 14-foot dinghies. And this year, 1968, Ian Bruce was sailing one of his designs in the Prince of Wales Trophy in England, won the Prince of Wales Trophy in 1967, won the Prince of Wales Trophy in 1968, brought the Tiff Up, the Kirby 3 back, took a mold off Tiff Up, started producing production Kirby 3s, and founded a company called Performance Sailcraft. The next product that Performance Sailcraft built after the Kirby 3 was the Bruce Kirby designed, Ian Bruce built Laser. So all sorts of things were happening in the Canadian yacht building industry at this time. All of it centered around Red Jacket and CNC yachts at this time. So what happened to Inferno? We talked about the Corvette, we talked about the Redline 41, we talked about Red Jacket. What happened to Inferno? And Inferno did exceptionally well in the Venice race. She was third boat to finish in the long distance St. Pete to Lauderdale race. She was going into a very good SORC. She goes into the third race, which is the West End race from Miami to the Grand Bahamas, and that's the heaviest air race of the series. Bruce Kirby, I mentioned, wrote about the SORC, and he described this race. He said it was blowing so hard that spinnakers were popping like balloons at a porcupine's birthday party. It was a heavy air race, and it finished at night, and Inferno had trouble finding the entrance into West End, and she went on the rocks at the entrance, and she pounded. This was heavy air, remember. Spinnakers were blowing out all over the place, 8-foot seas. She pounded for 3 hours. She was lifted 4 to 6 feet with every wave and dropped on the rocks. Charlie Morgan looked at her, shook his head, and said, when I come back in the morning, that's going to be just a pile of rubble. She survived for 3 hours, got towed off by the Coast Guard after 3 hours. And other than badly mauled, the keel was bent, the prop shaft was bent, the prop was mangled, the hull was abraded, but they pulled her off, and she did not take a drop of water. They were able to tow her back to Miami for repairs, and structurally, she was in perfect condition except for some cosmetic abrasions. Balsa Ecuador, look at that. Look at Red Jacket's performance. She wins SORC going away. Look at Inferno's performance, pounding on the rocks for 3 hours, suffering no structural damage, and they go out on an ad blitz, basically. And this is a Balsa Ecuador ad promoting Red Jacket, wins tough ocean racing series going away, and Inferno survives 3-hour battering without leaking a teacup of water. So the whole concept of cord laminate construction, lightweight laminate structures is becoming now the norm. And at this time, the top ocean racers were either wood or aluminum. Very shortly after that, cord fiberglass construction would take over the high end of the yacht racing business, as it still is. But it wasn't over yet. 1969, actually, I should say, at this point, John Byrne starts publicizing the whole, he's now in charge of marketing at scene, starts publicizing all this Red Jacket race results. And he has just sold a Corvette to a fellow by the name of Bob Sale. Bob Sale is president of Waldwin Stodgill financial company on Bay Street. And John Byrne and Bob Sale start talking and said, Bob says, you guys have a lot going for you here. You got everything going for you except money. You guys don't have any money to do anything. Why didn't you go public? So John Byrne introduces Bob Sale to George Cuthbertson, and they decide to create a public company called CNC Yachts. And it's going to be an amalgamation of Cuthbertson and Cassian design, Eric Bruckman, custom boat builders, who now has created a company called Bruckman Manufacturing, George Hinnerholer, who was building the CNC designed Invader and the Red Wing 30 and a bunch of other boats, and Ian Morch at Belleville Marine. And those four get together and in September 1969 create CNC Yachts. But as I say, while all this was going on, there was still racing a Canada's Cup campaign. Cleveland Yacht Club had challenged RCYC for the Canada's Cup, which RCYC had won with Venture back in 1954 because of George Cuthbertson's involvement with Norm and industry and all that. But there's another Canada's Cup contest going on, and all three Canadian contenders to defend the Canada's Cup were CNC designs. Manitou, even George will tell you, was pretty well a direct development of Red Jacket, and she was sailed by the three principals in Red Jacket. She was sailed by Osler, Fisher, and Connolly. Fisher and Connolly alternated the helm, and Jack Beatson was aboard, and all the Red Jacket people basically involved in Manitou. Then David Howard, who had won Canada's Cup in 1954, was sailing master on Innisfree and initiated the Invader George Hinterholder project, was sailing a boat called True North, which was also cord composite construction built by Bruckman. But she had a conventional, quote unquote, very short full keel with a rudder on the back end of the full keel. But that boat proved to be uncontrollable downwind. So they'd already designed it so a rudder could be fitted to the transom. So she was essentially converted to a fin keel with a rudder on the transom, and her rudder on the keel became a trim tab. And the third boat built for the Canada's Cup campaign was a Redline 41 Mark II called Bagatelle. And that was owned by Alan Taylor here in the photograph here, who would later, very shortly after this, become chairman of the board at CNC Yachts. And she was built by, up here is Brian Jorgensen. I referred to Brian Jorgensen with Eric Bruckman as being part of the whole Metro Marine area. And Manitou won the trials, of course, and beat the American Challenger boat called Niagara, and it's Sparkman and Stevens design. So Cuthbertson and Cassian, to gain through Red Jacket, through Manitou, was beating the best S&S American designs available at the time. And that created this whole Big George, Little George, cumbersome and casual marketing thing that was going all the time. And what it did, and what Red Jacket did, and what the creation of CNC Yachts did, was created this whole Canadian boat building industry. And I mean Canadian boat building industry. There are Canadian designs being built by Canadian boat builders, originally primarily for the Canadian market, and then it became international with CNC Yachts. CNC Yachts was the only builder in the world who was designing both custom and production boats to their own design in 5 locations in 3 separate countries. And it was just an international success. At that time, I just pulled this off an old brochure in the 1970s. This is a whole product line from 24 feet right up to CNC 61. They built the CNC 61 on spec. They did not have a buyer for the first CNC 61. They had so much confidence in their abilities to produce winning boats that they built the first CNC 61 Sorcery on spec. A buyer, James French Baldwin, finally came along, and she was named Sorcery. Of course, the first 4 letters of Sorcery are SORC. So that's the whole, importance of Red Jacket and the SORC all ties together in the creation of CNC Yachts. And Red Jacket's longevity. She did race the 1969 SORC as well, did not do as well, primarily I think because Perry Connolly at that time was getting ready to race the Canada's Cup in Manitou. So he was focused on other things. Connolly actually sells Red Jacket to Florida. A Florida buyer takes her in 1971. And Connolly at that point basically leaves competitive sailing. And all sorts of things were happening in the early 70s in sailboat racing. The primary one, of course, was CCA. The CCA rule in 1970 was replaced by the IOR rule, International Offshore Rule. And so all the boats like Red Jacket were designed to the CCA rule. Overnight, didn't become obsolete, but they certainly were not, they did not benefit from a change in the design rule. And in 1973, Doug Peterson produces a boat called Gambare, which designed specifically to the IOR rule, and the whole nature of yacht design and yacht building and yacht racing changes with Gambare and Doug Peterson and Dick Carter, and a whole bunch of new designers come on board. And all these older CCA boats like Red Jacket and the CNC 43s have a challenge. But Red Jacket is down in Florida. She's no longer that competitive. She's established a racing trend that other boats follow. The boats are becoming more stripped out, more built for racing rather than cruising. And so she languishes in Florida till about 1975, I think. And then Norm Walsh, who started George Cuthbertson in yacht design as industry. Norm Walsh goes to Florida, buys Red Jacket, brings her back to the Royal Canadian Yacht Club, hands her over to Peter Bowman, and she starts racing again. And then the major event that happened in Red Jacket's life at that point was when Paul Phelan acquired her. Paul Phelan owned her for about 25 years. And Paul Phelan went back to CNC Yachts and said, and took her back to CNC and said, I want this boat. I'd like you to update this boat for modern IOR racing, and I want you to put a teak deck on. And because Paul very much believed in the concept of a traditional yacht. Traditional yachts had teak decks. So he put on a teak deck, and amongst other things, they put on a new keel that was designed for racing a deeper draft, a new rudder, and they put on a taller rig. Her first rig had been replaced actually before the second SORC with a double spreader rig and tighter chain plates, moved the chain plates in. But now they increased the rig above the house, increased the size of the mainsail, and this is the configuration that she's racing now. And then when Peter Milligan bought the boat from Paul, actually from Paul's son, Paul had passed away by then, in 2007, he took it back to Mark Bruckman, the son of the original builder of Red Jacket, Eric Bruckman, and he asked Mark to update the boat again. And the first thing he asked was take the teak deck off. And they took the teak deck off. They put a whole new interior in. They replaced any deteriorated balsa core in the decks, because the worst thing for balsa core is, of course, to put a teak deck on and drill holes all over the deck to attach the teak. And basically, Peter Milligan goes through a multi-$1,000 refit on the boat and puts it into pristine condition. And she has raced ever since. And with Brian Gooderham, that's Brian Gooderham sailing her there. That's Brian Gooderham sailing her in that previous picture. Brian Gooderham starts working with Red Jacket during the Paul Phelan years. He carries over with Red Jacket into the Peter Milligan years and is still with her today. And the reason she is in such pristine condition is because of the devotion of people like Paul Phelan and Peter Milligan and Brian Gooderham. So when we get her this summer, she is going to be, as Peter's brother has told us, in pristine condition. She's going to come to the Marine Museum this summer. And we are going to we're going to make her available to everybody who wants to sail her, because our goal is to make her available to the public. I have to admit, in my 15 years with CNC Yachts, my 7 years with Mark Ellis, my years in the core business with Paul Tech and ATC, I have never sailed on Red Jacket. So I'm looking forward to steering that boat upwind myself. And that opportunity is going to be open to everybody. And as Michelle mentioned, the museum has the CNC collection of drawings and are in the process of digitizing those. There's over 4,000 drawings there, and that's going to cost a pretty penny. So, and the goal is to make those drawings available online to anybody who wants access to them. And so we're looking for people to contribute to help us make that happen. Otherwise, it's going to take many years. So Michelle, I will, that probably went on longer than most people realized or wanted to go through in far more detail, but if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Thank you so much, Rob. No, that was wonderful. Yes, we are welcoming questions over the YouTube chat. Feel free to enter in there. I have been kind of jotting down a couple questions that came up, and I think those of you in the audience, it's great that we have so many sailing racers. I'm not a sailing aficionado, so forgive me if I'm getting the terms wrong, but I am very grateful we have a number of people joining us this evening who have been able to help with the questions kind of as they've been coming in. So I thank you all for doing that. If you're not able to use the YouTube chat to send your questions in, I will welcome you to send them by email to marmus@marmuseum.ca. That's marmus@marmuseum.ca. And again, that email will be provided in the chat for you. I will be taking a look at that. But first, I would just like to say thank you so much, Rob, for that wonderful presentation. It's I have to say, I mean, I've been working a little bit more now and getting familiar with the CNC collection, helping to apologies if the cat's meowing in the background. getting to know a bit more of the CNC collection as I help with collections requests, etc. And I know there was one recently dealing with red lines. So it's nice to actually be able to, it's one thing looking at the plans, but it's another thing seeing the photographs and hearing the stories about the vessels and understanding why people are so passionate about them. I'm very much into the history, but as not being a sailor myself, it's a different area to kind of learn a bit more about. And but I can understand that I can recognize the passion of why somebody would be so fond of these vessels and have such care and custodians of them. So I'm going to go and pull one question that came in early on from Charles Kidd. The question had to do with the composite technology, and the question was, how scary was the adoption of composite technology? Was this a matter of actual technology or commercial acceptance?
Well, as far as scary was concerned, I said people had been building fiberglass boats since the mid-1950s, and George Cuthbertson started building his water rat dinghy in 1953. And even he back there admits that it was touch and go. He didn't know which boats were going to cure and which ones weren't. But by 1960 and 1965, certainly, fiberglass technology was becoming more accepted. It was pretty primitive. One of the slides I didn't include was the laminate schedule for a red jacket, which was all 1 ounce mat and 24-ounce woven roving, which nowadays is downright primitive. Nobody uses those materials nowadays. But the key to red jacket was the cord construction, and that's the part that where she actually broke ground. And as you can see with the original the photograph of it being laid up, they hedged their bets by putting all that fiberglass strapping in to take the load. And that strapping also was there to separate a lot of the areas of balsa in case water would migrate through the balsa. And it's interesting that for many years after Red Jacket was built, they kept pulling her out of the water and weighing her because they were worried about water migrating into the balsa because that was still an unknown. Balsa had not been used below the waterline at this point, and there was a fear that water would migrate through the fiberglass into the balsa. And when I worked for Baltec for many years, Kurt Feitinger, the lab manager there, spent a lot of time convincing people and doing long-term tests, immersing balsa cord laminates in water under pressure for years, and then measuring the moisture content of the balsa to prove that the balsa would not absorb water through the skin. And so that was the unknown at the time, was how the balsa would behave underwater. Now everybody knows that if you put balsa on a deck and you start drilling holes in the deck and water starts migrating through the balsa, you're going to have problems. Balsa has to be installed properly. But on Red Jacket, which did have some balsa core problems in the deck after 55 years of life, the hull is still pristine. There's no evidence of water in the balsa in the hull. And there's a second part of that question that I didn't quite catch.
It was was this a matter of actual technology or commercial acceptance?
Both. The success of Red Jacket in performance and Inferno for durability was the thing that Baltec kept promoting, the safety and performance aspect. So once it became accepted in the racing world, it then became a commercial success. I mean, the reason I joined Baltec. I mean, I designed for CNC, I designed for Mark Ellis, I designed for Hunter Marine. Then I got into the core business with ATC and Tom Johansson. Then I got, I was asked to join, Baltec came to me and asked if I'd work for them. And I said, this will probably be my last job. And it would be great to go out with go with the company that I'd started with, basically. My career in yacht design started with Red Jacket, which was the first balsa cord boat. So it seemed fitting that I would now work for Baltec Corporation. So I was quite happy to do that.
I can imagine. It's quite fitting that it ties it all well together.
Yeah.
A follow-up question to that came in from Richard Sartorius. How good was its hydrodynamic efficiency?
Say again.
how good was its hydrodynamic efficiency? Perhaps we're referring to Red Jacket herself.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a very, very valuable point, because what I didn't get into was how much she was tank tested. This time, the Stevens Institute in Hoboken, New Jersey, Pierre de Say, was doing tank testing on 3-foot models. Actually, behind me on the cabinet back there, you can see behind me is the tank test model for the CNC 61 at Stevens Institute. So Red Jacket was tested quite extensively at the Stevens Institute, and George did that because he had never designed a fin keel boat before, and what they found, the original rudder on Red Jacket actually came right up into the hull, right up flush with the hull, and they tested that model. And the model displayed excessive weather helm, and they couldn't figure out why. And then Pierre de Say said, "Well, let's test it without the rudder and see what happens." So they tested it without the rudder. And towing tank is literally putting the boat in a towing tank, heeling it, and giving it a certain yaw angle, and towing it down the tank and measuring the lift and drag on the boat, and then extrapolating that to full size. And so they did it without the rudder, and everything was fine. There was no evidence of weather helm. And so they tufted the boat. They put tufts of wool or fabric on the boat and tested it again, so that way they could follow the flow lines over the model. And they noticed at the stern there's a cross flow, what Pierre de Say called a laminar cross flow on the model at the rudder. And they figured because the rudder was up against the hull that it was blocking that cross flow and was creating weather helm. And so they cut the top of the rudder away from the hull. And that's why Red Jacket has that very distinctive spade rudder that sort of sticks down from the hull. And all CNC designs after that had that spade rudder with their that didn't go up to the top of the hull, and that's because of the tank testing data. I'm not sure it was entirely accurate, but because of that data, they cut the rudder away and went with that model, and when they built Red Jacket.
Okay. Another question had to do with the keel shape and what led to the radical swept back design.
That's an interesting question. I talked about tank testing. Red Jacket was built originally with the keel that was shown on that drawing, and then they started tank testing. And then Canada's Cup came, and Manitou started tank testing Manitou. Basically same hull as Red Jacket, but they're testing keel configurations. And what George found, George wanted the biggest advantage of the fin keel over the conventional keel is reduction in wetted surface, amount of hull in contact with the water. Get rid of that whole back end of the keel, which is doing nothing anyway, and that just reduces the drag. And so George was obsessive with reducing drag, and so he looked at parts of the keel that weren't working, that he felt weren't doing enough work, and he looked at that. If you look at that drawing, and you look at that sort of the upper aft part of the keel, he said, let's get rid of that. So he took a great triangle out of the back of the keel and got rid of that wetted surface. He kept the leading edge of the keel the same, but got rid of that triangle of area at the back of the keel. And that's what created this illusion of sweep. George specifically says he did not go out of his way to design a swept keel. He just got rid of that extra wetted surface, which created that sweep. And when they tested Manitou, she tested better than Red Jacket because of that keel. And so they put that swept keel on Manitou, and then they changed the keel on Red Jacket. I think it was in 1969 as well. And Eric Bruckman told me the story on changing the keel on Red Jacket. He said the shop at that time was so primitive, they didn't have any overhead lifts, and they had to lift the boat up with jacks. They jacked the boat up, put oil drums under the cradle, and they're going to change the keel. They're going to take the old keel off and put the new keel on. And they had her sitting on her cradle with cross beams underneath it and up on oil drums. And the keel wouldn't come off. It wouldn't come off. And then finally it broke loose. It fell to the floor, fell right through the cradle, broke the cross beams on the cradle. And he said they came within a whisker of losing the whole boat. Because the only thing holding it up was this broken cradle. And they finally got things put back together and put the new keel on and went and got some overhead cranes for the shop.
That's definitely answered the question. Your comments coming in saying thank you for that. I think I have all the questions specific to the presentation answered, but there was a couple that have come in about our collections. And so, Rob, you know them a bit better than these ones, better than I do. Perhaps you can answer the question about the Hinterholer collection in the archives, what the extent of it, I guess.
Yeah, the Hinterholer collection is an interesting one because Richard Hinterholer and I go back a long ways to my Mark Ellis and non-such days when he was at Hinterholer Yacht. He's a good friend. And George got into yacht design because he was designing his own boats, obviously. Hinterholer Yachts started out with the Shark, and then the Niagara 30 was the next boat, which was a bigger shark to his design. The Shark was his design, of course, as well. And he did a number of boats to his own design before, and even while he was having boats built that were CNC designs, Cuthbertson and Cassian design. So Richard Hinterholer very generously has donated, I think there are 8 rolls of drawings. Rich could probably tell me more accurately. Well, you could probably look on the computer and tell me, to the Marine Museum. And he came to George's house, and I was there with Maurice Smith, who was the curator. And actually, when I showed that picture of the design office in 1973, what I neglected to mention, this is entirely aside, was one of the people in that photograph was Ruth Coombs. She was the only woman next to Ruth Gard in that photograph. And Ruth Coombs would soon after that become Ruth Smith, because she married Maurice Smith, who at the time was the captain of the brigantine Pathfinder. And Maurice Smith, very soon after that, 1976 or 75, would become the first curator of the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston. And that's was one of the connections between George Cuthbertson and the Marine Museum, was through Ruth and Maurice and all that. And so that was interesting. So getting back to Richard met with Maurice Smith and I and George Cuthbertson at George's, and graciously donated his father's drawings, except for the Shark, to the Marine Museum. The Shark drawings are still owned, and again, Richard could confirm this, by the Shark Association. So that was actually a very memorable event when we got the opportunity to add the George Hinterholer drawings to the total CNC Yachts George Cuthbertson collection as well. And as I mentioned, as we were talking about earlier, we also have the TBF Benson drawings. And TBF Benson is the most famous Canadian yacht designer that nobody's ever heard of. He designed in the 20s and 30s in the Depression and during World War II, when things were tough for yacht designers. But we've got the only known record of his designs, which included our boats and George Cup and Richardson Cup winners. So anyway.
You heard it there, everyone. Rob has the full sweep of our collections in terms of sailing and yacht design, sailing, boat design. I'm going to get the terms all confused, but we've heard it there. Thank you so much, Rob, for filling that information in. For anyone who is interested, I said we are working on getting them these plans digitized. We have funding to digitize about just over 500 of them, but that leaves 3,500 more left to digitize as part of that project. So if you're able to support the digitizing of these funds, that would help enormously. The link again will be provided to a donation form on the YouTube chat, and it will help us make it a lot more accessible to you, the public, and just and enables you to easily access them. They become more right there visible on the screen rather than us having to go and scan them, and hopefully that we have the right plans and that you're looking for. There has been a couple of instances of we scan them, send them over, and actually they're not quite the ones that you're looking for. And so that will help resolve that problem. It'll provide them easy access to you to view them, to see them, and to order them if that's what you should wish to do. Rob, thank you so much for being our last speaker of the Nautical Nights Winter Speaker Series. We will be holding a spring one, but the details of that have yet to be confirmed, so stay tuned on that front. If you're not already on our newsletter list, I invite you to sign up on our website. If you go to our website, www.marmuseum.ca, the newsletter sign-up form will pop up. Just give it a few seconds, and our next edition will be in the spring, in May, so stay tuned for that. Other than that, I thank you everyone for joining, for sticking with it this evening, and sticking through our entire series. It's been a wonderful series to host this year, and I thank all of our speakers, and of course Rob again for joining us. And I hope everyone stays well, stays positive, and keep in touch. We'll be back in 55 Ontario Street, and hopefully in no time at all, and with Red Jacket soon to grace our waterfront, or our pier rather. So thank you again so much. Take care and have a wonderful evening. I get over here to end the live stream. There we go. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
So are we